Uh, so again, thank you so much for coming. We are here for the Mullins lecture with our distinguished speaker, Dr. Amit Prasad. I'll introduce him here briefly. Dr. Amit Prasad teaches in the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Institute of Technology, where he is also an affiliate faculty of the Atlanta Global Studies Center and the Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience. His research is aimed at excavating the history of the present in relation to post-decolonial, transnational, and global aspects of science, technology, and medicine. In particular, he investigates how genealogies of colonialism continue to animate present-day values, norms, ideologies, and practices, including in our own field, STS. He is the author of Imperial Technoscience, Transnational Histories of MRI in the United States, Britain, and India by MIT Press, and Science Studies Meets Colonialism, which is a mandatory reading in our intro to STS, so most of you have read this. Presently, he is writing a book on his decade-long study of a stem cell therapy clinic in India that is tentatively titled Miracle or Science. He is also the treasurer of the fore and an editor of the journal Science, Technology, and Society. So join me, please, welcoming Dr. Prasad. Thank you so much for coming.
First, thank you, Fernanda, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming, and of course for the invitation as well. Now, many years ago, I think I was either like I was finishing my PhD or I just finished it. I had come here for a symposium in which Sandra Harding was presenting. This is quite some time back. And I still remember Harding at that point of time, while she was discussing her feminist standpoint, saying, and when men present their ideas, they call it criticism and growth of knowledge, but when we do it, they call it feminist squabbles. And I use this quote quite often in my class when I am teaching particularly feminist science studies. I also remember the wonderful discussions I had, like with students and faculty out here, on various aspects of even marginalized debates within STS, including feminist standpoint, and of course STS too. Now, today, very much in the same spirit, I wish to talk about colonialism, postcolonialism, and science and technology studies, or STS. Like in my presentation, what I wish to do today is to turn the spotlight. I'm not going to talk about a micro study, what I've done otherwise, but turn the spotlight on the field of science technology studies itself. That is how STS as a field has engaged with colonialism, postcolonialism. 3 years ago, well-known Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, while speaking at Humboldt Forum in Germany, made a straightforward but profound claim. She said that if we acknowledge that present-day Europe is shaped by the Renaissance of 600 years ago, by the Enlightenment of 300 years ago, then surely we cannot say what happened merely 100 years ago in Africa no longer matters. She was specifically referring to how in Europe and more broadly in the West, even when colonialism is acknowledged, it is very quickly relegated to the past and its impact minimized. Adichie added, Europe has developed a way of telling the story of its colonial history that ultimately seeks to erase that history. She then went on to present examples of such erasures, particularly those in relation to museum artifacts, because the debate was on museum artifacts. Adichie's claim, however, also raises an important question. How does Europe and the West tell the story of itself that ultimately seeks to erase that colonial history? Specifically, what are the constitutive elements of such storytelling? Does such storytelling occur in our own field of science and technology studies, or STS? And if there is such an erasure of colonial history, does that impact how we engage with issues and concerns of the present? A key element of colonial storytelling is forgetting. This forgetting is a result of long history of epistemic gerrymandering that has been intimately tied to constructions of European Western self and that of its non-Western others. And because of colonial Western control over knowledge production and dissemination, These erasures over time became a part of a broader collective and societal amnesia, a sort of colonization of memory, to use Walter Mignolo's words, though ironically here it seeks to erase the role of colonialism and colonization. One could argue that the birth of modern Europe and what we call the West is inseparable from such colonial storytelling. For example, in the late 15th and 16th centuries, that marked the start of European imperial expansions to the Americas, Asia and Africa. Debates in the Spanish court on the colonization of Americas and in relation to American Indians explicitly justified the killing and forced servitude of the natives through epistemic gerrymandering that was tied to colonial imaginaries of the self and the other. Juan Sepulveda, the official historian of the Spanish court, for example, wrote in 1547, "It will always be just and in conformity with natural law that such barbarous and inhumane people submit to the rule of more cultured and humane princes and nations." Sepulveda deployed a wide range of arguments, including that the natives did not possess either history or rationality, to justify the destruction and servitude of the American Indians. Writing around 325 years later, in 1883, at the high noon of European colonialism, British historian J.R. Seeley, whose book Expansion of England proved an immediate and long lasting success, he chided British people, particularly the historians, for their indifference towards this mighty phenomenon of the diffusion of our race and the expansion of our state. Seeley used the word race to literally highlight the growth of the white race, because according to him, the two main ties that hold together an empire such as Britain and distinguishes white settler colonies in Canada, the United States and Australia from, for example, the empire in India, were those of race and religion. According to Seeley, what ties Britain to its empire in India is not a community of blood. Two races could scarcely be more alien from each other than the English and the Hindus. Seeley reminded that, and to those who took a dark view of the British Empire, Seeley reminded that to see the reason for the continuation of the empire, one should simply see what the introduction of science of the West has done to undermine the fixed morals and traditions of the Indians. This is the East Indians, the one I belong to. Seeley in his widely, origin of, Seeley in his widely cited and popular book, this book was an immediate success and it is still very widely produced and cited. It draws on an imaginative geography and history to accentuate the distance and difference between the Europeans and the rest. More importantly, particularly for the purpose of my presentation today, Seeley presents imperial colonial expansion as a European Western story that is guided by competition between, for example, the English and the French, and colonization is argued as an unintentional act. He famously wrote, "Britain seems to have conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind." Seeley's argument still continues to be deployed, on the one hand to show how imperialism was not so central to European Western imaginary of self, and I am talking of just last few years, you can see the citation even now, and on the other to criticize its veridicality. I discuss it to highlight that an intrinsic element of colonial storytelling which parallels the emergence of modern Europe is forgetting, a forgetting that is intimately tied to, as I said earlier, constructions of European Western self and the others, and achieved through historiographic and sociological erasures. What about our own field of STS? The early writings of STS rarely, if ever, mentioned colonialism. David Bloor in Knowledge and Social Imagery, for example, reminds us at the outset that, and I am quoting him here, the cause of the hesitation to bring science within the scope of a thoroughgoing sociological scrutiny is lack of nerve and will. He cited Durkheim's study Elementary Forms of Religious Life for penetrating the very depths of a form of knowledge, and suggested that although Durkheim dropped a number of hints as to how his findings might relate to the study of scientific knowledge, the hints have fallen on deaf ears. He calls on sociology to move from studies of primitive cosmologies to that of our own culture, that is the Western culture. What is forgotten here is that anthropologists and sociologists' focus on primitive cosmologies was not necessarily because of lack of nerve and will. Durkheim, for example, had outlined his objective for studying religious life of the Australian Aborigines thus: my study of a very archaic religion will not be for the sheer pleasure of recounting the bizarre and the eccentric. I have made a very archaic religion the subject of my research because it seems better suited than any other to help us comprehend the religious nature of man, that is, to reveal a fundamental and permanent aspect of humanity. Primitive cosmology was of interest because it was seen as reflective of the past of the modern and scientific European self. Such an imaginary and the sociological anthropological inquiries it fostered cannot be separated from Orientalist and colonial storytelling, particularly its denial of coevalness for the non-Western others, an issue which was widely discussed and criticized within the field of anthropology from around the time when STS was emerging. Early STS scholarship, however, ignored this colonial genealogy. Take, for example, one of the most productive STS concepts, bricoleur or bricolage. I am sure many of us have used it. I in fact have written a book chapter itself, bricolage as method. Mike Lynch rightly argued in his book Scientific Practice and Ordinary Action that the distinction between bricklayer and engineer, to quote him, has been used and undermined by sociologists of science and ethnomethodologists who have described the bricolage of laboratory shop practice. STS scholars were not alone in undermining the distinction between bricklayer and the scientist, but through a focus on the laboratory practices, they were the first to empirically show that the scientist was not unlike the bricklayer, and scientific practice was bricolage as well. Interestingly, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who had introduced this distinction between bricklayer and engineer, had deployed the French term bricolayer. There was no such opposition before that, and used it in opposition to the scientist or the engineer to distinguish between the primitive from the modern European way of thinking. In doing so, Lévi-Strauss was engaging with a long history of European Western academic discourse on this topic and critiquing the then existing radical and dualist distinction between primitive and modern scientific way of thinking that was proposed by, for example, well-known philosopher Sartre. In fact, the last chapter of his book, Savage Mind, is basically a critique of Sartre. But this genealogy of the concept of bricklayer and bricolage is not even mentioned by STS scholars. The imaginary of the scientist and scientific way of thinking was, and continues to be, a common trope to distinguish the European Western self from the primitive non-Western others. Henry Kissinger, writing in 1977, again around the same time period when STS was being born, for example, argued, empirical reality has a very different significance for many of the new countries than the West, because, according to him, cultures which escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view that the real world is almost completely internal to the observer, quite simply that they cannot be objective. This philosophical schism, he further argued, was at the core of the instability of the contemporary world order, and he has continued to give this argument, till he died, of course. One could nonetheless argue that STS, by empirically deconstructing the presupposed universality and rationality of modern science, and by showing science to be multiple and contingent upon circumstances, undercut the very basis of dualist divides such as that between primitive non-Western and modern Western ways of thinking. I am not sure one necessarily follows the other. That would be like assuming that if we were to empirically show that the biological basis of racism and sexism is false, racism and sexism would disappear. Let us revisit the historiography of the scientific revolution, which, as historian of science Margaret Osler argued, and I am quoting her here, is probably the single most unifying concept in history of science. The concept of scientific revolution and its historiography is not that old. Interestingly, its emergence coincides with the time when European colonialism was formally starting to end in the mid-20th century. As historians of science David Lindbergh and Robert Westman pointed out in their introduction to a volume on reprisals of the scientific revolution, Herbert Butterfield's lectures at the University of Cambridge in 1948, which was later published as a book titled Origins of Modern Science, proved to be extraordinarily influential, deeply shaping the work of historians of science. The influence of the scientific revolution as marking the birth of modern science in Western Europe, thereby constituting an exclusive history of Europe and the West, and providing an explanation for the so-called great divide between the West and the rest, continues to the present day. However, as Stephen Shapin highlighted, both the terms, that is scientific and revolution, have been contested within the field of history of science, of course STS as well. In fact, in the very first sentence of his book on scientific revolution, he declared there was no such thing as scientific revolution. Nonetheless, Shapin justifies writing about the scientific revolution because, as he says, the very idea of the scientific revolution is partly an expression of our interest in our ancestors, where we are late 20th century scientists. But who is a part of this we and our? Butterfield was very clear and upfront. The scientific revolution he had declared we must regard as a creative product of the West. In fact, the whole point, as he says at the outset in the book itself, was to tell the history of West as it has not been told earlier. The origin of modern science, according to Butterfield, depended on a complicated set of conditions which only existed in Western Europe. In another book, The Origins of History, which was published 25 years later in 1981, Butterfield put his claim even more clearly. We are often reminded that the civilization of the West is scientific in character, and we do not always remember that it is equally remarkable for being historically minded. In both fields, the development that took place in Europe was unique. In some ways, he is repeating the Hegelian argument as well, but you can see how these come together and crystallize. In Butterfield's historiography of the scientific revolution, colonialism and its role are forgotten. There are brief references to the non-Western world in Butterfield's book, largely as sites of discovery. However, in one of the chapters that is interestingly and also ironically titled "The Place of the Scientific Revolution in the History of Western Civilization," Butterfield discusses the role of what he calls, like the term he uses, Asiatics in the downfall of Rome and Western Empire over 1500 years ago. According to Butterfield, down to the time of Newton's Principia, the Asiatics continue to be the aggressors. Moreover, as he further argued, and I am quoting him again, because of their, that is the Asiatics' activity over so many centuries, it was the western half of Europe that emerged into modern history as the effective heir and legatee of the Greco-Roman civilization. Butterfield's historiographic framing of the scientific revolution thus constructs a European identity that links modern European self to the ancient Greeks, while the so-called dark medieval ages of Europe are pushed further into the dark. In the process, the non-West is presented as the other, who is either the aggressor or passive recipient of modern science once it emerges in Europe. Interestingly, in the numerous and ever-burgeoning histories of the scientific revolution, this particular chapter from Butterfield's influential book is rarely discussed. This book is still taught very commonly in history of science particularly. And if it is discussed, this particular chapter, for example by historian of science Flores Cohen, it is presented as, and I am quoting here, one of the very few specific historically informed treatments that explained the differentiation of the West from the rest. Perhaps we should ask not just what history and historical representations are, that is, interrogate the veridicality of historical writing, but also what historical writings do. That is to say that we should investigate not just like the history of particular events, for example the scientific revolution, but also the historicity of the concept too of the scientific revolution. Even if we were to persist with the concern with the origin of modern science in Europe or shift in the thought that comes about with science in Europe, could there be a different genealogy and history of this origin? J.P.S. Oberoi, a sociologist of science, who after his studies in United Kingdom and Australia taught at Delhi School of Economics, presented an alternative genealogy in his book Science and Culture, which was published in 1978, again around the same time when STS was being born, but it is rarely if ever cited by STS scholars. Oberoi argued that the question of liturgy marked the watershed between the medieval and modern cultures of Europe. Specifically, the question of whether the true body and blood of Christ are corporeally in the bread and wine became contentious and focus of important debates and led to a shift in the modern European thought. According to Oberoi, Ulrich Zwingli, one of the key figures in Protestant Reformation, by the way, he is not somebody who is so importantly discussed in terms of the role of Reformation in transforming. He radically transformed the debate at the Marburg Conference, which had occurred in 1529. Oberoi writes, and by stating the issue, that is whether the true body and blood of Christ are corporeal in the bread and wine, by stating the issue in terms of a dualism, or more properly a double monism, Zwingli discovered or invented the modern concept of time, in which every event was either spiritual or corporeal and material, but no event could be both at the same time. And you can see here, like for example, the way biographies of Newton are written by removing the occult part of his work. Oberoi argued that the resulting dualist separation, such as that between fact and value, forms the basis of modern science. Now, I must admit that I am wary of origin stories of modern science, because for me as an STS scholar, if there is no singular science, it does not make sense to talk about a singular origin. Nonetheless, I wish to emphasize that if one is interested in situating radical transformation in modern European thought, Oberoi's thesis and the commonly accepted one that, for example, Butterfield presented, not only offer very different genealogies, but they also present very different European identities. For example, in Oberoi's genealogy, medieval history of Europe does not simply evaporate. It presents a very different European identity, and it presents a very different European identity as well. The concerns that I have highlighted in my presentation until now, albeit important, may not seem moot for our field, because normally STS does not engage with broader historical periods and is focused on histories and socialities of very specific events, practices, technologies, or institutions. However, do we end up erasing colonial histories even in micro studies? Now, before I proceed further, I should add that the forgetting of the role of colonialism within STS continued for a long time, and it was only with Sandra Harding's interventions in mid-1990s and thereafter through the work of Warwick Anderson, postcolonial science studies gained a foothold, albeit a small one, within STS. However, as I have shown in my recent book, even postcolonial science studies continually slip into Orientalist and colonial representations. Now, let me clarify again. I'm not suggesting that individual STS scholars or STS as a discipline have had any malintention in deliberately erasing the role of colonialism. I also wish to emphasize that although I critique several STS scholars and their work for the erasure of colonialism, I continue to admire their contributions and engage with the work. My concern is our failure to recognize the depth of the role of colonialism in the making and imagining of Europe and the West, as well as that of modern science and its practices, which results in STS works being haunted by specters of colonialism. Let us take, for example, a micro study this time, the well known and widely cited article on Zimbabwe bush pump. Now, the quote on the right side is from a blog. This article has been popular not just among academics, but also like various other people, because it is such a wonderful story. In fact, this article has also been cited by a well established, very well known postcolonial STS scholar as an example of postcolonial studies. I remember when as a graduate student I had shared with a senior STS scholar about my dissertation also involving a non-Western context, namely India. He promptly asked if I had read the Zimbabwe bush pump article and suggested that I should take that article as a useful model for my research. It is indeed a wonderful article. Marion Delate and Anne-Marie Moll, the authors of the article, offer a radically different vision of scientific practice than what Bruno Latour presented through his study of Louis Pasteur. the Zimbabwe bush pump. This is how it looks actually. The Zimbabwe bush pump, as Leighton molds show, is characterized by its fluidity, and its designer, Peter Morgan, in stark contrast to the Machiavellian pastor, dissolves his own authorship. In Leighton Moll's words, Morgan is an ideal man, for he too is fluid, dissolving into his surroundings. Interestingly, what the authors do not mention at all, that Peter Morgan is a white man who was born in England, and after receiving his PhD in marine biology from University of Hull, moved to Malawi in Africa. They do mention another transition though. They do mention, passingly mention, that Morgan moved from Malawi to Harare on the invitation of by the Zimbabwean then Rhodesian Ministry of Health. Through this passing reference to Rhodesia, the colonial name, one can notice the spectres of colonialism, but Leighton Moll do not even use the word colonialism or colonial. Although when Morgan moved to Harare in 1972, Zimbabwe was still a white settler colony. It is also important, if you were to look at Peter Morgan's book, which is the main source of the article, most of the photos have black people there, and the reason why it is there is because in the white settler colonialism they were pushed into the most arable land, even though they constituted 90% of the population, 95% of the population. In fact, Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was called then, was in the midst of the second Chimuranga, a bitter war of independence from white settler colonialism at that time. These details are not only forgotten by the authors, but they are also not even noticed by many STS scholars. When I had first presented my analysis of this article at a colloquium in a Midwestern university, most of the STS scholars present over there were surprised that Morgan was a white man from England. They had presumed that he was a native Zimbabwean. It is almost as though there is a collective amnesia. The issue for me is not that a white man from England cannot be an ideal hero in a non-Western context, or that colonialism must be central to any storytelling about the non-West or the West. However, isn't it ironic that while STS prides itself in showing context dependence of scientific knowledge and practices, it forgets the colonial context of its own knowledge production? I have discussed in detail implications of these erasures of colonialism and coloniality in my latest book. In the talk today, I simply wish to emphasize that such an erasure, on the one hand, gives an illusion of the non-Western other or their knowledges as an alternative, and on the other slips into presenting white man as saving the non-Western world. The issue is not, as one STS scholar shared with me, that studying and representing non-Western societies is fraught. In relation to the role of colonialism, particularly its erasure, as I just discussed, study of the scientific revolution and its occurrence in Western Europe is fraught as well, though that reinforces the colonial storytelling. Moreover, we cannot assume rather, that what happens, say, in a laboratory in the Western country is separable from colonial history and not impacted by what is happening in the non-West. We cannot also assume that the legacies of colonialism would not be present in the events of the present. I remember when I started my study of COVID misinformation and conspiracies, a persistent and common response was that the spread of COVID misinformation and conspiracies reflected growing anti-science attitudes. In my study, I could not find one single COVID conspiracy or misinformation spreader who called himself, herself, or themselves anti-science. I actually started the work before Google and others had started to shut it down, so that was quite an experience. They would just take me to all kinds of deep hole to just find out about these. In fact, the conspiracy and misinformation spreaders continually deployed an idealized understanding of science to present their claim, which itself, as I've tried to argue, is an artifact, a colonial artifact itself. Another striking thing that I found was that the same conspiracy or misinformation was most often justified through different references and tropes among the white and the black communities here in the US. For example, the trope of freedom and protection of republic was commonly deployed by whites, while reference to Tuskegee or slavery was often seen in the claims of black people. How are we to understand these references without a reference to the past particularly? My research has been focused on the history of the present, as Fernanda mentioned here. I combine Foucauldian insights with regard to history of the present, but do it differently, in the sense combine it with STS methodology to investigate genealogies of the present, particularly the colonial genealogies. I have shown that in relation to the invention and development of MRI, and in relation to overseas therapy provided at an embryonic stem cell clinic, on which I am writing my next book. In the last few years, I have also been struck by the frequency with which the terms colonial and anti-colonial are being deployed in the public discourse, particularly in the non-West. For example, you can find it being deployed by the coup leaders in the West African countries or by the Indian foreign minister. I have never seen actually so often like this particular words being deployed for very contradictory reasons too. So, I am not saying, I am just saying how it has come into being. I strongly believe that these heterodoxies and orthodoxies in relation to the colonial discourse, to draw on Pierre Bourdieu's language, reflects a crisis which necessitates even more careful investigations of the genealogies of colonialism and further analysis of the continued and multi-layered impact of colonialism. The emergence and growth of postcolonial science studies has been an important step in that direction. However, an influential section of postcolonial science studies, in its bid to give voice to the erstwhile colonized other, often slips into replicating the Orientalist and colonial construction of the non-Western other as well as the European Western self. Specifically, they present the non-Western other as an ontological given, as a kind of a unified identity, and forget that the non-Western others are also historically constituted in complex and contradictory ways because of this colonialism. A particular reason for that, I believe, is our failure to much more carefully and rigorously investigate the complex genealogies of colonialism, even in the postcolonial science studies, particularly how profoundly European colonialism has shaped ideas, people, institutions, etc., both in the West and the non-West. Let me illustrate my claim with an example, and that is with what I lent, that of Hindu science, which has seen a resurgence in recent years in India. If you were to do a simple Google search of the phrase Hindu science, that is within quotes, you will get nearly 100,000 results. There is even a Twitter or X handle by the name the Hindu science. Like any other Google search, this one too starts with a couple of taglines: things to know and people also ask. Among the things to know, the first thing is that is put over there: how scientifically accurate is Hinduism? And the answer that is provided there is this: the great thinkers of ancient Bharat, that is India, like now they are using this term as well, spoke of how energy and matter at atomic levels could influence one another from long distances. This is now called quantum entanglement. Hinduism is the only spiritual tradition which accurately estimates the age of the universe as per modern science. It is not only non-experts who have written on Hindu science. A number of scientists and engineers as well as historians have published articles and books on this topic. A recent book by a physicist who teaches at SUNY Oswego, the title of the book is Ancient Hindu Science, states in the blurb itself: to understand modern science as a coherent story, it is essential to recognize the accomplishments of the ancient Hindus. Research on Hindu science and its achievements has received a big boost under the present Indian government. However, references to and discussions on Hindu science or Hindu medicine has a long history, in fact a long colonial history. Its emergence can be traced to the work of the Indologists and the Orientalists in the late 18th and 19th century colonial India. Sir William Jones was a key figure in reinvigorating research on ancient Indian texts to highlight the achievements of India. Not surprisingly, when Praful Chandra Ray published his widely known book, A History of Hindu Chemistry, this was perhaps like one of the pivotal moments in transition, so that is why also he literally thanks Sir William Jones in the very first sentence there. P.C. Ray's work, as well as those of others in Hindu chemistry or Hindu medicine that appeared during this time, around this time, they are not that unique, in the sense that this period also saw the emergence of Chinese science, Islamic science, etc. Interestingly, during this period, even though science was commonly used to distinguish the Europeans from the rest, that has a long history as we know from various works, since the genealogy of modern science was not completely folded within the West as it happened with the historiography of the scientific revolution, These works commonly highlighted cross-cutting and cosmopolitan exchanges between, say, the Hindus, the Greeks, the Arabs and the Chinese. This genealogy of modern science paralleled another genealogy with which modern science was seen, within which modern science was seen as the only universal and objective form of knowledge. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India, had, for example, stated, "Science and technology know no frontiers. Nobody talks or ought to talk about English science, French science, American science, Chinese science." In his autobiography that was published in 1936, Nehru even remarked, "To the British we must be grateful for one splendid gift, of which they were bearers, the gift of science." I jokingly respond as though one needed colonialism for this. As historians of science such as Gyan Prakash have shown, modern science became the reason of the state in post-colonial India as well as in other post-colonial states. And as such, it undergirded the development and modernization agendas. These two genealogies were, however, not hermetically sealed. For example, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when all these alternative science arguments emerged, when J.P.S. Oberoi, whose work I just mentioned, and Ashish Nandi and others, they presented arguments of alternative sciences. So, there is also, I want to show that when STS was emerging, there was other ways of also critiquing and confronting modern science, which was emerging in other parts of the world, which was very often not even recognized as much. Now, Ashish Nandi, whose book is on the right side, contrary to some of the criticism of his work, was not dismissing modern science. He, not unlike Max Weber's work on the role of Protestant ethic in the development of capitalism, or Robert Merton's work on the role of Puritanism in the development of science in England in the 17th century, shows how Hindu values were central to the scientific works of physiologist J.C. Bose and mathematician Srinivasan Ramanujan. Interestingly, when the science wars happened in the US, another front was opened in India. Meera Nanda called not only scholars like Indian scholars like Ashish Nandi and others, but also STS scholars and proponents of post-colonial science studies such as Sandra Harding, prophets facing backward. She put it bluntly, "The oppressed others do not need patronizing affirmations of their ways of knowing as much as they need ways to challenge these ways of knowing. They do not need to be told that modern science is no less of a cultural narrative than their local knowledges, for they need the findings of modern science understood as transcultural truths in order to expose and challenge local knowledges." Nanda's main concern was the rapid growth in what she called saffronization of science in India, that has been marked by tracing of genealogies of accepted scientific principles and technologies to ancient Hindu texts such as the Vedas. Such claims have proliferated in recent times, and many of them are evidently outlandish. Such claims have not only received support from the Indian government, but the present Prime Minister of India himself has made claims such as the existence of surgery in ancient India through reference to Lord Ganesha having an elephant's head. Nanda criticized not only these outlandish claims, but also arguments for alternative sciences, criticism of modern sciences. In fact, her argument very much replicates what Herbert Butterfield had to say with regard to the emergence as well as what science is. Nanda is also very clear that all claims of Hindu origins of scientific principles or technological inventions are pseudoscience, and they reflect, to quote her, Hindutva's science envy. She is certainly not alone in voicing such concerns. She is also not wrong in suggesting that such claims reflect some kind of an envy. One of the scientists who has been a staunch supporter of excavations of Hindu origins of science, for example, stated, and this is all very recent, you can see 2019, "We are a race which is not inferior to any other race in the world. Great things have happened in this part of the world as well." What is forgotten in Nanda's analysis is the colonial genealogy of such mimicry. Cultural studies scholar Homi Bhabha defined colonial mimicry as, and I am quoting here, "the desire for a reformed, recognizable other as a subject of a difference that is almost the same but not quite." This was the goal in the introduction of English education in colonial India, to create, I'm quoting again, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and in intellect. As such, the development of this anglicized class of Indians was inherently marked by a racial divide, such that to be anglicized was to be emphatically not English. This ambivalent, by English I mean English person, not the language. This ambivalent world of mimicry, according to Bhabha, constituted the anglicized colonial subjects, like I am a part of that too, not quite, not white, as he calls it. The historiographic framing of the origin of modern science in Europe and thereafter its diffusion to the rest of the world combined this colonial strategy with that of Eurocentric historicism, which relegated the rest of the world to waiting rooms of history through the temporal order of first in Europe, then elsewhere. The intersecting genealogies of these two colonial strategies can perhaps provide a better sense of what is going on with regard to claims of scientific firsts in ancient India. Indeed, as I stated earlier, many of these claims are outlandish, but they also mimic how Western discourse continually traces histories of the present day discoveries and inventions to an ancient, albeit constructed past of itself, mostly to the Greeks. Seen in that light, these claims of Indian origins of scientific discoveries could be read as, it is not that that is the intention of the people who are doing it, it could be read as a caricature of what Europeans and Westerners have been doing, except that now the Eurocentric temporality is overturned to an India-centric one, first in India, then elsewhere. Moreover, the racial divide that marked colonial mimicry is now completely menaced and is being displayed as, to paraphrase Bhabha again here, not white, but still quite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prasad, for your talk. We now have 45 minutes of comments and questions. And I'd like to know if someone has questions or comments here. We also have Zoom attendance. So the floor is open.
Hi. It's good to see you again. I got to meet you yesterday. Thank you for your talk. I found that this was really interesting because I don't think a lot about how the conception of the West is deeply rooted in colonialism. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of method in pursuing STS studies in a way that understands how STS is constituted by this sort of colonial ideals as well.
Thank you for that question. That's actually a very important question. So as we do know, I mean, and we have some people here who were pivotal in the start of STS as well, so they can comment on it much better than I can. STS came with a critique of the earlier like philosophy and history of science, which had presumed certain categories. So basically what was argued is that the context of justification, so to say, in the earlier writings were overwhelming the context of production of knowledge itself, the lab. So when the shift to lab came about, it was also a very empirical approach in a very deliberate way, in the sense to keep focus on it and not get lost with the theoretical and other concepts which were constructed. Now, in terms of what I spoke today, the difficulty that arose in the first instance is that the philosophers and historians of, so we have to ask this question, that when philosophers and historians were constructing, because, okay, let's take a step back. If you look at this construction of the universe, and I show this in my book actually, the universality of science and science representing a certain kind of humanist values, that is very much the work of historians and philosophers of science around from World War I onwards, particularly around that kind of a time. So it was intimately tied to, like, and very often this is the other forgetfulness. World War I and World War II were about the colonies. I mean, okay, they were fought in Europe. Basically, what you can see here is that post-Treaty of Westphalia in Europe, most of the wars and killings are like pushed to the outside, but it is in World War I and World War II it comes inside. But the fight is still about the colonies, which is there. So inherent to this, these tensions were there, but what you start seeing in the construction of the universal, this identity keeps getting lost, or rather gets hidden. So this aspect of like what I am saying here is that it is not simply the context of justification of science per se as a knowledge, but as also as an identity for formation which was there. That part was not given enough attention at that point of time. But there are also methodologically, if you go further within STS, for example, let us take the actor network theory. What actor network theory, one of the things which they critiqued is that you cannot start with the categories of gender, race and other things, because according to them, this becomes a methodological trick whereby the analyst imposes herself, himself, or themselves, and thereby restricts democracy. Now the question here, and they are not trying to say at all that okay, there are no hierarchies or these categories do not exist or so. They are saying they are artifacts of, they come about through the effects of network itself. Point well taken. But what you start seeing here is, and I am going more detail into methodology itself, is that they focus on the temporality but not the history. So if something is constituted through the effect of the network, people who, the actors who are entering that network, they also have history. They might have been constituted through that, but that aspect is forgotten, and that is why you see in actor network with all the like pronunciations of that okay, we can provide you a better understanding of hierarchies, and it's like people have criticized it for war metaphors. It is actually very benign for all the war metaphors and war language they use. The impact of colonialism, colonization, and so all of them are in very benign ways put there. So what you see, these also start occurring in specific ways. And again what you see, these are the slippages, and I showed you even if it's scientific revolution which we dealt with, and but at the same time we forgot what are these. I hope it answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amit. That was so great to hear your talk. It was so familiar, and I really resonated with a lot of the things that I've also been thinking about, and I think we've had some great conversations about this too. I'm actually interested in, you know, you cited so many works that I don't think, as you said, people don't read in STS. And one of the things that I love about STS is that it is so absorptive in that it can sort of, it has the capacity to absorb so many different perspectives and disciplines into and literatures. And so recently, for example, I read The Dawn of Everything by David Wengrow and Graeber. And it's an archaeologist and anthropologist who's giving a Paleolithic history and showing actually this whole linear stage even then was not true. There was a diversity of political organization and social life and all of this stuff, like if we, you know. So I'm trying to think about like how in educating ourselves and our students, how to encourage and put it into the canon of STS, readings from all these different kinds of spaces. Because, you know, right now, for example, and I'm sorry if I'm going a bit length, but thinking about democracy, which is something that I really care about, it is so exceedingly Western-centric. It really just goes back to the Greeks, Rousseau. I mean, all of those liberal imports are into STS thinkings of democracy. But to read even adjacent to other political theory, post-colonial theory, indigenous studies, and that are not in STS, like it gives you so much to deal with. And in 4S, you know, in Amsterdam, I saw that it was so siloed, and there was no crosstalk. And I would love to think about how to change that, you know.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's actually a great question. We were discussing earlier. Actually, catch-22, I feel, has become even bigger and much worse. So what I am seeing, for example, I don't know if you people are seeing with the students here or otherwise, that very often many of the people, like as STS has expanded on the margins or so, they have not necessarily exchanged in depth with the STS as well. Very often it is just a few small things on which people like come up together. one is a critique of universalism and non-context dependence of science or so. But very often when they are coming to it, at times I'm thinking, okay, how are we discussing? So like with regard to STS as well. In fact, this question has come even with regard to when we are giving the book awards. Like we have ended up giving book awards, I mean, you've seen this, that okay, this work is not STS. Okay, it is about science technology, what we do. Now the issue here is not about boundary keeping. It's about how do we discourse, not just with the other, but with ourselves. Because, okay, with all my critiques, they also opened up lots of doors. So how do we bring together, and this is not an easy task because of the fact that STS is expanded so much. So the way I look at the core is sort of like stuck, and it's not being able to have some arguments, like to expand it further. And the margins are just going in different kinds of directions. So it becomes something, this is something we need to have a much broader discussion on as a discipline. Again, not in simplistic way that, oh, we want to control the boundaries, that okay, only this is STS or otherwise. But how do we grow if we do not also engage with what STS has already been there? Leave alone these other things that you talked about. And this I'm finding even with my own students, really, really hard task. And this is perhaps we should put on the agenda, like as a STS, that how do we do it, so to say. But this is what I would say to that in a sense here. I don't know if it makes sense. I completely agree with you, like, I mean, when you say, for example, like this liberalism, like, I mean, it's tricky when we say democracy going back to Greeks, because we know Socrates and others were against democracy. And there's a large tradition of that. It is very much, we are talking of the liberal aspects of it, and there is, like Uday Mehta has this lovely book, Liberalism and Empire, wherein in the very definition is folded the imperial exclusions. How do we bring it together? And I think this is where we need to have, maybe someone, like we should write articles on it. How do we get these good dialogues? Because it's almost become, I don't even know what is STS these days, at times. So, yeah.
I have a couple of questions
Sure,
from
please.
our Zoom participants. So if there isn't anybody else in the room, I'll just ask them back to back, if that's okay.
Sure, and then I can come back.
The first one comes from Rebecca Hester, who's in France. And she asks, she says, thank you so much for this talk. It was very generative. Can you discuss why you use the idea of forgetting rather than ignoring or dismissing these histories?
I deliberately, actually, I thought quite a bit with regard to, like, in the sense of the fact, because dismissing, first of all, let's go to the dismissing. Dismissing and also ignoring to an extent actually presuppose an intentionality. But what we often forget is that through the discourse, the way it has occurred over time, and that's why I had gone way back earlier, then went to like 1883, which is high noon of colonialism and all. What happens is that it becomes a way, like through the discourse, constituted as subjects to the extent that, for example, in my class, one time I was teaching globalization, and I was talking about the extinction of the bisons in the US. And people were just surprised. They just didn't know this story at all. That how, like, parallel to like colonization of Americas was also this making extinct, so to say. And it is not that these students are actually either deliberately trying to ignore or dismiss. It is the way the discourse itself has been constituted. And so it is more, so to say, that's why I said collective amnesia or collective unconscious. I did not use a collective unconscious because then I would have had to elaborate or go into whether and how it is different from, for example, psychoanalytic, because I'm not at all providing a point de capiton for this analysis. I'm much more providing the genealogical analysis per se. So that is the reason why I don't use it. And this is also, I'd like to say that I'm not, this is why I kept repeating, I'm not at all saying that, okay, here is what you're saying is wrong. You just, I mean, and this is like why I went to the Hindu science. You can see this is happening in the colonial context. And this is my critique of standpoint. What standpoint are we looking at here or something? So that would be my answer to it.
Thank you. There's at least one question in the room, so we're going to go back to the room, and then Zoom folks will be back with you.
Thank you. This is an application question.
Sure.
If you were responsible for teaching an introductory STS course to graduate students, and you wanted to incorporate or integrate colonial approaches, how specifically, given the genealogy problems, would you do that?
That is a wonderful question. And if you were to ask me honestly, that I was not thinking of writing this book. What was happening, this Polity Press editor was after me to write something on globalization and postcolonial. I said, okay, I'm not interested in writing that way at all. And then eventually I got to write that. I said that, okay, I have to bring this out simply because the debate has to come in the open. The other part was, I mean, there is a difficulty I have with regard to some postcolonial enunciation. Let me give you a simple example. So one of the most popular, like this thing becomes like this concept of postcolonial technoscience, isn't it? Because it so beautifully combines this idea of like science information that is implied in technoscience, like the Latourian concept, and postcolonial. But what it forgets at a very basic level, as I mentioned with regard to methodology, Latour and actor network theory people are dead against starting with a category. They go over and over again, be it gender, race, colonial, or whatever else it is. Issue then arises here is how do you combine? I mean, it sounds very nice when you talk about Edward Said's Orientalism together with Latour, but it doesn't make sense, because you have to take it further, that how do you add history to the actors or otherwise. But what starts happening, and this is where the difficulty, to go back, that I start feeling, that it becomes so nice as shorthand to move beyond. So you start using it without seeing the implications of it, so to say. So it is not an easy task at all in some ways, and I think the way I am trying to approach it is to keep pressing it in a further way. I don't have an immediate answer. In some ways, like with regard to the way the book is written, I deliberately try to keep it as little theoretical as possible. There is a fair amount of all this, but in my earlier, because I often use the Derridian deconstruction, this thing, that I would deconstruct the dominant discourse and then I would research empirically. And I would show so that they are not reductive. But I thought, okay, this is becoming, a lot of people told me, this is like getting too complexly theoretical or whatever. But it's not an easy task. You are the DGS. I don't know how you manage it. I mean, it is.
Fernanda said she was going to figure it out.
Yeah. We will see, I mean, like in the sense of like how do we teach. But what I am saying is that what we need to do is to introduce at least some articles, some like STS, some even outside ones. And the idea necessarily does not or should not be perhaps that a comprehensive idea, but in the sense of forced into thinking that, okay, what am I missing? And then, because there are limits perhaps what we can do, just to be practical.
So you touched on this a bit in reference to Nehru, in talking about Hindu science with reference to Modi. I was curious if you could speak more at all about the role of post-colonial states in intervening in these discourses about what science is and how to sort of incorporate science in the non-Western world.
Yeah, thank you again. This is the other part. Very often when we have a certain kind of post-colonial, not all of course, but certain kind, we see the other as a site of deliverance or transcendence. What I wanted to show, not necessarily at all. It can be a site of menace in certain ways that can also be there. Because we often, like, okay, I'll give you a simple example of myself. Okay. I am a 5th generation college going for so-called Western education. All the literature that I have read is in English. Okay, my accent is still South Asian or something. I've never read any Hindi literature at all or anything of that kind. I studied in a Catholic school, which, like, I remember one of the fathers in 8th grade had come over and written over there 80 different Indianisms, that's bad English or something like this. So what we start seeing here in the first instance for us to understand that these are also the limits of identity or standpoint politics. Standpoint can disturb the dominant. It cannot offer alternatives per se very easily. And so in that regard, the idea, like, to go back to it, at times I have found it harder, like when I'm presenting on colonialism, for example, in India. Because one of the examples, just to take a step back, one of the examples that I give in my book is that I didn't know this. The East India Company, which was responsible for so much destruction of India, growing opium in India and selling in China, which led to opium wars. The East India Company army was responsible for all the destructions and things like that. It had become defunct, but it was still alive, so to say. An Indian origin guy buys it and rebrands it into a luxury brand, luxury company. How are we to understand? And he says that. I mean, I analyzed that over there. He's saying that how actually this is an anti-colonial act. It is an anti-colonial act only to the extent that we can also be colonial now. We are not divided by the race anymore. So we have to bring these kinds of contradictions. And what we see, and this is where my argument with regard to Hindu right, like when it comes the right wing, whatever, they are, if you look at their model, completely colonial. They just follow the model. Yeah.
I have the second question from Zoom, which is a double question. Someone posted and then someone liked it, reinforced it. Could you say more? We really like this idea of epistemic gerrymandering. Could you say more about it?
So in the sense of the fact that I was trying to find a genealogy of the concept, and I did see in some, actually like a business article, which was talking of epistemic gerrymandering, but in a very specific sense of leaving out certain data or information when certain decisions are being taken or something like this. The reason I was coming to it in some ways is that what is happening here is that something which has been talked about. For example, Homi Bhabha draws on this Native American proverb that white man talks with a forked tongue. He says that post-enlightenment discourse is not false, but it is forked. Now the question arises is that how does it occur in practice? And that is where you start seeing actually gerrymandering. So for example, Michael Taussig, in his like Devil and Commodity Fetishism, very fascinatingly talks about that the Spanish would very directly talk about the violence they were doing, while the British, when they were documenting it, they would just say that this trope is not right or so, and they will keep, so to say, civilizing the language as well. And that is what, in a sense, I was meaning. And what happens is through these various examples, when you come now, it is almost like completely invisible because of this kind of a gerrymandering, like remove this part, drop this part, and you would be constantly asked, oh, so what about this? Here it is right. And that is the trick with epi. It's not false, but it is gerrymandered in this way, and you will always be asked in that kind of a thing. So that is where I was coming from, but I haven't published it as yet. I was thinking like to elaborate it further later. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk. My question is about the other end of the spectrum of colonialization and the colonized subjects. What do you think about their contribution in shaping the Orientalism and colonialism, at least in the discursive level? I mean, because there are some studies that shows that Orientalists were at the very beginning in contact with some people in the Orient, and their understanding of the colonized society is shaped based on these connections. So it sounds like it's the whole discourse is shaped in a back and forth between colonizers and the colonized subject.
I think that again is a very, very good question in a sense here. So if we follow Edward Said's argument with regard to Orientalism, he starts off by saying that how Napoleon, when he goes with all these historians and other people who collect all this data about the other, that is, so to say, the modern Orientalism coming in, that through the data you're constructing the other. So if you look at in the context of India, and you can look at the other elsewhere too, so they go there, okay, there are people like William Jones who had learned Sanskrit and they were very good in it, but they couldn't translate that many texts. There are actually many more texts in Sanskrit than there are in Greek actually, like if you go back to the ancient times. So it was very difficult. So they hired all these Brahmins basically to do the translation, but they were guidelines. So there is not just colonizing or disciplining of the people going on how to do it. And there were ways this was being picked up and represented outside as well in certain ways. So what I would say here, yes, it is like there were complicit, whereas like elites. I mean, again, to give you a very literal example, why go that far? the reason for my great-great-grandfather, what ended up happening, he was one of the first to get a bachelor's in science when the British education was introduced. So when the railway lines were being built, so they gave him a part of the contract, he and his brother. And so what they ended up doing is that they, together with the people who were working, established a whole village and became a landed person. Thankfully, my grandfather decided to give away the land. This is complicity, isn't it? Inherently, which is there. But there is also, we have to go even further. For example, if you read Mary Povey's The Making of the Social Fact, you will see, for example, how English were writing about the Scottish. It's almost like colonial. In fact, forget about going that far. When I was doing my MRI research, one of the most important places in UK where MRI research was being done was Aberdeen in Scotland. And I met scientists who said to me that why they left England because of the fact that the way English people would make fun of their R's or things like that. So there is this kind of a thing. But Scottish were among the really important people in constructing the colonial discourse as well. So even what we need to open up is also the others inside in so many different ways. I can keep giving you examples. David Rodriguez's work comes to my mind like Wages of Whiteness, that how the Irish and the other, particularly African American workers, they could not come together because of Wages of Whiteness. And Irish became like the face at that point of time through the blackface minstrels. So there is this we have to accept and see. I mean, this is not easily unified and nothing wrong. This is how it is.
My question is about, is there a consequence of this disruption of the dualism of the colonized and the colonizer when someone becomes not white but still white? Is the consequence just reinforcing colonialism? What happens?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I do feel at one level it's not reinforcing colonialism, but it is deploying the colonial strategy and tropes in some ways. So what ends up happening is the world is changing really, really fast. There is no doubt about it. But at the same time, I mean, there are limits. Even now, the hierarchy plays out in the global context in so many different ways. So what I was trying to show in the first instance here is that this is actually a mimic of being colonial, that we can be also colonial now. We are as good as what you could be or something like this. But because of the fact that it does not have an agenda of colonizing either the minds, the languages, resources or otherwise, as of now at least, this is how it is. We cannot go to the next step that you are asking, like we were asking about.
Yeah.
So we can't go that far, but we do see a very colonial representation here. Does that make sense? Yes. Because if there was, because the representations that were made during the colonial times, they were intimately tied through extraction of resources and labor. Till now, we do not see the non-Western erstwhile colonized, even when they're expressing colonial tropes. I mean, they're using it like with other countries to an extent, but not to that extent.
Hi, it's nice to see you again, and looking forward to hang out with you in the evening. So let me think how I should put, because I have a lot of things going on in my mind right now. So Monami touched a little bit about she used the word democracy and why and how it's important for her. And there are two, so I'm interested in war, and there are two major wars going on right now. I'm more interested in the Russia-Ukraine war. And so this, I think, of course, we always say that, Putin, he wants to bring back old Soviet Union, and he is making all this, outlandish commentary, and he even writes pseudo-historical, journals, where he is saying that, Ukraine is not a legitimate state, and it's being created by West, which is some kind of colonization. So in order to keep our traditional values intact, which Ukraine is part of, so we have to invade Ukraine in order to stop that colonization happening. So do you think that he is justifying colonialism in that context to make this invasion happen? And then America and other European nations are sending all these equipments to Ukraine. saying that the so-called democracy is being jeopardized. So what kind of democracy are we talking about here? If we think about democracy, the democracy kind of definition given by America and West, or it's something else. So how this colonialism and democracy are playing role in the current context, in foreign policies and the warfare that's going on right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, so one reason, and like I'm glad you linked the two, like one reason I was a little hesitant with regard to going on democracy as well, because democracy as a term, very much like if we look through semiotics point of view, is a signifier which in some ways, to use a Lacanian term, suppresses the signified, in the sense it includes a wide variety of things inside. And so if we see a particular recent discourse with this, like particularly starting from Bush era, what starts happening, democracy becomes, and Arundhati Roy shows it really, really well on this, how it becomes a tool of, so to say, like having various kinds of interventions. So what you start seeing in the first instance is, what we will have to see is how do we define, what do we go about cutting across, even in the Western nations. I mean, you look around right now with elections right now. There is a debate, there is a crisis. How are we going to, what is the meaning of democracy or otherwise? So there is one kind of debate which is there, and I'm not so sure it is a very clear-cut linear genealogy just coming from, let's say, just Rousseau or Locke. We do know, like for example, there was a significant difference between Rousseau and Locke themselves. So there is like something which we need to trace well. I mean, how do we understand what's going on in the US, I mean, for example. So to say it this way, so we have to open it up, get into these questions, interrogate it further. For example, what happened in January 6, let's just take a step back. What happened in January 6, can we separate it from the fact that the imaginary of this as a white settler republic, not just colony? So think for a moment all these questions which are there. If I was to, and this is a tricky thing to talk about with regard to Russia, what is going on right now as such over there or so, the fascinating thing for me as an academic or analyst was not simply the fact of like this kind of justification they were giving. If I was trying to just find out, okay, how do people, like this is something of interest, how do people justify? And the idea for me is not simple reductive answer of causal argument, to see how the discourse can be understood. One of the justification is actually a very interesting kind of colonial this thing which is going on. The argument that is given on is that this is a much more older colonial fight between the Slavic and the non-Slavic West of the European part. There are all these arguments which are like frothing and coming together. Now, what I would say in practical terms of the justification, that is another matter. I am not a policy analyst to talk about it. But to me, the interesting part that is there in a sense here is that how those tropes are traveling and how they are being deployed in a sense to either make an argument for or against. So at one time they are saying, for example, the US, that it was responsible for the color revolution, that's what it got in and things like that. At another level, they are also criticizing the Western democracy that it is not workable. So then you are, and it's specifically what I have been struck by people who have been extremely critical of the Western imperial part. They at the same time are just suddenly you will see they will come up and say, oh, the reason why US is going down is because of all these LGBTQ things. And I'm thinking, okay, what happened here? I mean, like, so what you start seeing, how do you see these things being, and that's why I said here also, it is a crisis. When I use Bourdieu's term, it is a crisis of heterodoxy and orthodoxy we see. We don't see a path as yet. At least I am not able to see it over.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much. And the last things you've said, you're starting to get at my question. Foucauldian, now I hear myself. Histories of the present, genealogies, are initially have been about accounting for how what's dominant became dominant. But in Foucault's own work, which kind of pissed me off, is that that doesn't go into how then to inflect dominance, how to mess with dominance, and in what ways. Rather, it's the accounts authorize such inflection, but don't take any more steps. It seems to me that you are, and it seems to me that the kinds of issues we're grappling with are about that, which is I mean, what kinds of dominance are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about the rise of specific kinds of dualisms.
Yeah.
Is it sufficient to just inflect them, to call attention to their limitations? Is it sufficient to, critique them and call attention to how realities don't fit these? I mean, my sense is no.
Yeah.
Rather, it's maybe essential condition, but we must go much further. But then the question becomes the who or the we here,
Yeah.
and what sort of audiences are we speaking to? So my question in this is, how do you go about thinking about going beyond the history, the genealogical,
Yeah.
the genealogy itself, into the practices
Yeah.
and the theorizing?
Yeah.
What I'm thinking of is inflection.
Yeah. That is actually such an important question. Thank you for asking. I mean, just to situate it. I mean, I too. I mean, I have admired Foucault a lot. I mean, Foucault's work. I mean, if you can see on my bookshelf, literally, I have each and every of them, which I have read also diligently. But what you start seeing is that, okay, a lot of people argue that he starts very structuralist. For example, in Order of Things, going to archaeology of knowledge, where in Order of Things he says very explicitly that we are constituted as subjects through the discourse, almost in a limiting way. And that becomes his own entrapment. In fact, some people argue that it's very fascinating that how between History of Sexuality Volume 1 and Volume 2, he takes 4 more years, and it is in Sexuality Volume 2 that he talks of this resistance, so to say. But this is a resistance very individual level through Diogenes or these other kinds of through your practices of self. It is not what it is. This is where I have felt, to be honest, and I think one of the things which we don't talk of enough of with regard to STS. STS, not just actor network theory, but also much broadly was always about expanding, so metaphorically speaking, the network. It almost always, politically, if you look at it, one of the things it was what when Latour says that his way of I mean, okay, I will have all these criticism also, but at the same time, I do know, if with regard to even Latour, that somebody, I remember I met somebody in Calcutta who was starting a journal, and he writes to Latour, and he sent an article. I mean, he wouldn't do for many other people who are situated here. I mean, he's no longer there though. But this idea of building the network or expanding, this has been another aspect of STS which is very important, and that comes through the empirical studies themselves. So, in a sense, to go back here, when we are disrupting also, what we will also have to ask is that how do we make the alternative networks? So, in some ways, when I was writing even this book at one level, I felt, okay, I have shown all of these things also, and somebody told me also that you got to write something else now, that okay, where do we go? I mean, criticism aside. And I would have to ask, and it goes back to the earlier question that was asked with regard to STS itself, that how do we teach, how do we go about, how do we do in the class? There is a lot of interest that I do see. Now, I do understand this is still amorphous, in terms of giving an argument. I'm not giving a Foucauldian kind of anybody that, okay, this is the way to go. But I do feel that I would like to follow the line which I think feminist STS as well as STS more broadly have followed, is how do we build the community of intellectuals as well as political actors, and then build on it further. And this comes from another reason, to be honest. I feel, and this is again another aspect of STS I agree with, democracy has to come with standing with, not standing for. So, in the sense of that, how do we stand with these, whatever is going on in certain ways, that is where I feel it. But that I am struggling with. So, this is where I said to you that Foucault, I use the idea of trying to trace the genealogies very much in his later part, when he is talking of not in reductive linear ways, drawing on these connections. For example, if I am seeing over and over again the reference to Tuskegee or slavery in just explaining misinformation, it's wrong. I mean, of course, it's a wrong information, factually speaking, and all that. But it also tells the replication of certain genealogies. Why is it I don't know if you people ever saw, I didn't find, rarely I could see any of black people talking about protection of republic of freedom. How else are we to see it except through genealogies of colonialism out here or something? But then how do we go further in a certain way? I try to use STS to go into the empirical, but this is something I'll have to go further. But there is a frustration there with regard to, and that is where I leave it to an extent. But I feel there is something. That is where STS, we also need to bring it out. And we have practiced it in our lives, but how do we bring it as an intellectual tool? Like if you look around, the very fact that STS has grown so well on the margins, or some, like as you said, like with regard to accepting, not necessarily absorbing, but accepting also. We'll have to think, how do we make it into a good tool? I mean, like an intellectual tool as well. I don't know. I haven't thought it. So that's what I'll say.
That's great. We have more 2 questions
Yes.
Before we finish, Chris.
You've actually really started to answer, this was sort of a 2-part question, and you've started to answer it. So the first part is, in light of your discussion of the extension of the boundaries of STS, I would like to hear how you define STS. And then the second part is, can there be an STS that exists outside of the colonial or colonialism?
So the last bit I'm a bit outside of colonial or colonialism means in the sense that would it always be inflected by it, or yeah?
I'm reading someone else's
Oh,
question,
sure,
but
of course. Yeah.
they may weigh in
Yeah.
with more
That's
finesse.
fine.
But for now,
Yeah.
we're starting there. But the first question is, how are you defining STS?
So here is the thing. Actually, I'm not so sure that if you go, I mean, I went back to when I was writing this, like bricolage as a methodology, like went back to the early writings. I'm not so sure that the earliest STS scholars were defining the boundaries very, very strongly. There were certain basic principles of acceptance. Of course, the symmetry principle, which is there. In fact, that was being challenged, and in fact, Mike Lynch wrote very recently that, okay, maybe we need to circumscribe the symmetry principle of looking at true and false belief. And I argued with my COVID paper that no, we don't need to actually. We go and, so that was there. The idea of context dependence is there. There are few of these other principles on which we believe in with regard to science, multiplicity, and things like that, which is there. But I am not so sure we were ever, or have been even now, to define that, okay, this is exactly it is, like in some ways as sociology defined. And in that sense, some of these disciplines, they are more forgetful, even though anthropology has challenged a lot more or things like that. But this is a debate we need to have. We really need to have, and one very important reason for my writing the book was this only, that we really need to have a hard discussion, not to define the boundaries, but in terms of how who we are and where do we want to go from here. Now, as far as the colonial or gendered or racialized, like one of the things which bothers me a lot actually is the fact that if you look at science, technology, medicine have been so central with regard to racial and other. Can you tell me some really good articles being published in SSS or STHV with regard to critical race or something? We haven't been good. I mean, if you just go around and like for us like meetings or so, I mean, like, okay, we have just now started to celebrate this diversity, and sometimes when I'm getting a little upset, I say that, yeah, East India Company Army was also very diverse. I mean, what kind of logic is this? I mean, we have to be like, yeah, I mean, this Catalyst is doing quite a bit, but this has to come to our main course of some of the discussions. It has to come in a big way. How do we fold them? Some of it occurred coincidentally at Hawaii. I don't think it was the intention. Now that I'm a part of the executive committee, I have to know this. The intention was not really to bring the indigenous debate in the first instance. It happened because the crisis of the fire and people had to go back. But that has initiated some interest. So my idea would be like to go into these debates and just accept. I mean, as I said to you, how can I be out of this colonial thing? I mean, forget about anybody else, just because I am like a brown person that was born, brought up in India. So I think that's not a barrier. The barrier would be like if I were to just dismiss or not accept it, and then interrogate it much more carefully. In here, yeah, interrogate it our own this thing much more. But yeah, no way. I think if that's what is meant by implicated, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question as well. Thank you so much for this talk and for the discussions. Actually, I'm thinking of how can we bring this conversation to a broader way of thinking, which would be the colonial gaze, in the sense that we are all implicated because we were, most of us, and I believe maybe here in this room, most of us were formed in the Western academia, and we learned how to have this colonial gaze. That was the method. The authors that you showed us are the authors who formed our disciplines. Durkheim formed sociology, and here we are discussing in that way. And then we went to STS and discovered some lights there. One of them was actor network theory. How can we break certain dualities? But then as Zoe Todd, who is an indigenous author, says, actually, the way that we, in some authors, she talks specifically about Latour. Yeah. The way that Latour brings the break between humans and non-humans is actually something that is already in our ontologies and in our epistemologies. Yeah. So why do not recognize that? Yeah. Why do not acknowledge that? And then here again we have the colonial gaze playing a role. Yeah. And I think that more recently, and this I think everyone here can see this happening with the climate change and all the crises we are facing, indigenous people have been saying, have been talking, have been protecting their territories and their lands and the forests, saying that this could cause something. There is a beautiful book called Falling Sky that was just published in English. It's a bit old. It was written in Portuguese. But this book also shows that how can we not wait for the worst if we are doing what is the worst. Yeah. We are treating nature as another instead of treating them as family. That's the idea of the shaman David Kopenawa. So if you could talk a little bit, maybe in a hopeful way, if we have a way to, because we are all implicated. And the only way we can do anti-colonial STS is ask ourselves all the time, am I doing this? Am I replicating what I learned, or I am trying to question that, right? If you could help us go in this direction, and I say that because one of my fears right now is that because we are all noticing the problem to a certain extent, it's very easy that we just reproduce the colonial gaze and start using indigenous methods and indigenous theories without bringing them to the table, without listening to their voices and all that. So yeah, this is the thing.
Well, thank you very much for asking this. In fact, it is interesting. There was a talk I was listening to by the Cameroonian origin philosopher Achille Bembe, and he says, particularly with digitality, he calls it return of animism. And in some ways, if you look at it, I mean, because this itself was a misrepresentation, that as though when people were looking at nature with certain kind of vitality, it was necessarily about like seeing them as a soul or otherwise, because that was like sort of transporting your Christian beliefs that, okay, that is only how life could be seen or otherwise. But what you have asked here is twofold. One is the fact here is that with regard to how do, I mean, these have already been there, and these debates, and how do we recognize. And it is ironic. Look at Latour, for example. If you remember in Pandora's Hope, he has this example where he talks of like how the breaking of the this Hindu idol leads to this what he through which he argues factish. I mean, I was a part of a workshop that History of Science at Harvard had held, thinking after Latour, and Chapin was presenting there too, and he had this about his Catholic beliefs. Why couldn't he talk about liturgy? I mean, it is sitting right there. So there is both fold of it, recognizing there, but also ourselves. So there is one, but this is what we requires a much more like the calling into question of ourselves. Is that okay? What are there? And those knowledges would imply anthropology is doing, geography to an extent is doing, and this came about through some crisis which is there. To how to bring them to the table, and I think what happened in Hawaii to an extent, and hopefully we'll do it more in Seattle, we'll do it more in that way, that how do we bring to the table rather than again create another another round of appropriations, and this has to be brought to the table. The other is also the debates. So it's not just Latour. For example, there are critical race studies scholars who have criticized Donna Haraway's work on particularly ethics towards animals and asked that, okay, why do you not look at slavery? And it is truly ironic when she writes her last book with all the colonialism and everything, it comes back to the population problem. Like, I mean, as though you forgot the genealogy of that. So what I would say here is that I don't, when I'm critiquing, I'm not necessarily its lack of hopefulness. It is coming from, in the fact is that, like, when I teach in my classes, I say that my job as a teacher is to make the ground under you a little more fragile so that you know where you're walking on, because people are just not noticing as well. And then we start getting into these debates and discussion in the parallel time. And we will have to fight, because we often forget these are not just knowledge issues. This is about resources, appropriation of labor, resources, everything which is there. So, we'll have to see.
So thank you so much, Dr. Prasad.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We have a get together at 5:30 at Eastern Divide. You are all welcome to join. And if you have any questions or comments, we are also here. But thank you so much. It was amazing to see this room today.